This is the HP Compaq dc7600 small form factor, a computer I bought off of eBay for like 20 bucks about a year ago in early January of 2023. At the time, it was a replacement for my old Gateway 566GE, which wasn't a very good computer because it was stuck on a Pentium 4 and 2 gigs of RAM since it was a 915 system. That's the short version of it. Much like that computer, this one came with a Pentium 4 630, an 80GB hard drive, and 1 gig of RAM, and Windows XP. But all of those have basically changed in this computer, with the most important one being the CPU, which, unlike the Gateway, can actually be upgraded on this computer. As mentioned previously, and as can be seen on the front of the case, this computer originally came with a 3.2 GHz Pentium 4, which was fine, but it wasn't really that great of a CPU, and I knew I could do better. The problem is, there's not really a complete list anywhere of what CPUs are supported on this computer. It's basically just luck. But I found an old forum post which suggested that you could get up to a Pentium D945 working in this machine. I ended up going and just finding a Pentium D940 because it was $6, and I figured if it didn't work, then I wouldn't lose much money. Fortunately, it does work in this computer after a BIOS update, so it's got a 3.2 GHz Pentium D instead, along with 2 gigs of RAM, a 400GB hard drive. No, that's not a joke. Leave it to Seagate to make the weirdest crap. It's also got an IDE LightScribe DVD burner along with a floppy drive hiding underneath, and a PCIe X16 slot for future graphics expansion, because this computer currently only has integrated graphics. Honestly, with all of this hardware packed into such a small case back in the mid-2000s, you would expect this thing to be really poor thermally, but actually it's not that bad. The important thing is it has this air guide that helps, well, guide the air from this front fan to the heatsink, and then it's pushed through the rear of the case, which is about the best way of doing this setup I think you're going to achieve on a small machine like this with pretty much no other intake. But it means that it gets better thermals amazingly than the Gateway, which had a worse CPU and a bigger heatsink. I'm sure thermals would be significantly worse with a GPU in here, but I don't have one right now. Something I want to change later just because it's cooler mainly. That being said, one of the most important qualities of this machine is that it's very easy to work on it with the drives and the power supply just flipping up, and for the most part they're completely toolless. And when you're done, it all just kind of mashes together into this tiny box. Otherwise, there's not really that much else to this computer that can be changed other than putting in some more RAM, which I intend to do later. The only other things about it is the expansion slot, since that's basically the only space there is in the case to put stuff. It has 2 PCI Express slots and 2 PCI slots, which you can't see because of this camera angle. And even the top cover, which is just held on with 2 snaps so that you can easily remove the top cover. In this machine's case, it's even easier because one of them is broken. As far as features of the machine go, we have microphone and headphone ports, along with 2 USB 2.0 ports, the aforementioned built-in floppy drive and DVD drive, the power button and power indicators, and a front intake for the cooling fan, which you need on this computer, of course. On the back, we have 6 USB 2.0 ports, along with gigabit Ethernet built in, VGA, legacy, serial, and parallel ports, keyboard and mouse ports, and line in and line out on the back. And the power supply, which I haven't mentioned yet, but it's 240 watts, which is good because you can't replace it. It's completely proprietary. Oh, and I forgot to mention this, but this computer also has a built-in speaker between the drives and the cooling fan, which is actually a really neat thing. That's pretty much all about it for the external stuff, so it's time to skip to powering the machine up, where already we reveal that this computer, much like the Gateway ironically, doesn't like holding its BIOS settings when it's unplugged, even with a CMOS battery in it, which is really annoying. That's pretty much the only bad thing about this computer I can think of. Since this isn't a consumer grade machine though, we actually get to view information and change things in this BIOS. It's pretty well complete for my standards anyway. You get overviews of the RAM layout and processor information, of which it's important to note that if you're going to put a Pentium D in one of these, you need to update the BIOS because the processor stepping is way out of date. If you don't do this, then it'll complain every time you turn the computer on. At least HP took care of this in BIOS version 1.61 from 2009. so that's good. From the BIOS, we can also view our device configuration as well as storage settings. We can even run a hard drive check from the BIOS, which is a neat feature, I guess, even though it's completely unnecessary in this computer's case. It even tells you what connector the hard drive is plugged into. That's fun. It also has a removal sensor on it, which I turned off because I don't need. And you can turn on virtualization technology on this if you wanted to really run some virtual machines. There's power management settings as well, and my favorite, the option where you can do this. Also known as the feature where you can blow out your eardrums, because this thing's loud. Fortunately, it never actually gets that loud in using it, but you could set it like that if you wanted a server. Otherwise, there's not really that much else interesting about this setup. It's mostly just boring settings. But you can execute a memory test as well. For some reason, I would think this would be together with the hard drive check, but I guess not. At least there's quite a few features in this BIOS that you can change, which is very different from most of the consumer grade crap that I've had to deal with. Apparently I still forgot to set the date. Nice. Anyways, unlike the Gateway, this computer can actually run Windows 7, which is what I've chosen to run on this computer for a little while, even though it came with XP. This isn't really the greatest experience since I actually have Windows 7 64-bit on this computer, with only 2 GB of RAM and a mechanical hard drive, but I put this operating system on this computer solely because I actually used it on my bench for a little while, and I wanted something slightly less out of date than Windows XP. You can still get away with using Windows 7 with modern programs for the most part, so that's what I put on this computer, although because it has a Pentium D, it could, in theory, run Windows 10 or 11. Maybe that'll be a future video idea? Anyways, there isn't too much on this computer that's worth talking about. It's mostly boring utilities and stuff. One of the programs we can't use anymore on this computer is Steam, which is no longer supported on Windows 7 as of January 1st. I filmed this video on Christmas Eve, which means I had 7 more days of Windows 7 support on this computer, which means we were able to take in one last session of the best game, Peggle. We're just gonna pretend like I don't own a non-Steam copy of this game. Pretend like this is the only way to play this game, and that it will be gone forever in 7 days. You'll really want to take it in because it's basically one of the only games you can run on this computer because the Intel 945 integrated graphics haven't been updated since 2007 and don't even properly run on Windows 7 to begin with. This is also a good opportunity to get a sample of that built-in speaker, which I actually really don't think is that bad, considering it's a built-in speaker, and most of them are usually just hot garbage. I'm used to built-in speakers basically being completely garbage, whether they're just incredibly tinny or you can barely hear them at all, but this computer actually has quite a good built-in speaker, which I guess is probably a side effect of it being absolutely huge. Otherwise, like I said earlier, pretty much not much else runs on this computer games-wise, so we're just gonna move on. Anyways, there's not really that much else that's interesting on this computer, but I do have some software on it, like Virtual PC 2007, for some reason. I mean, this computer can do virtual machines, but frankly, I don't know why you would on a Pentium D with 2 gigs of RAM. It's also got an old copy of Microsoft Office 2010, as well as some old Adobe software, which I threw onto this computer mainly because I can. Oh, apparently it's not activated anymore. Looks like I'm in trouble now. It does also have Firefox on it, but the amount of time it takes to load anything should be a very good sign why you shouldn't use Firefox on this computer. To be fair, it does do it, it's just not really that great. The entire time the hard drive is just sitting there chugging. Pretty clear this thing would benefit from an extra 2 gigs of RAM, but I just don't have that right now. Maybe that'll be a future thing. It's worth noting this install of Windows is pretty crapped up since it's pretty old. I transferred it from another computer, so it's pretty messed up. There's a lot of residue from programs that aren't even on here anymore that I need to take care of, so maybe a future video will be me restoring Windows XP on this computer, because to be honest, I think it's better suited to that, but this is just what I had on this computer. And as I alluded to earlier, the thermals on this computer actually aren't that bad, but that being said, they also don't seem very reliable since it seems to think the CPU is 25 degrees Celsius. But that's about it to this computer. There's not really much else to this specific install of Windows. I do think this computer would benefit a lot more by actually running Windows XP than trying to run Windows 7 on here, especially because Windows 7 gets pretty bloated after installing all of the updates and a ton of stuff on here, and a lot of this video was mainly me waiting for the hard drive in this thing to catch up. I could technically put an SSD in this computer, but it's limited to SATA 1.5 gigabits per second speeds, so probably wouldn't be much better speed-wise. And it's not like I need it to be solid state either. I'm not moving this computer around, so I might as well just leave it as it is. That being said, this computer doesn't need to be fast on this OS because I actually don't really use it very often. I keep this computer around mainly as an operating system test bench, if you will. The Pentium D came out around the period of time when hardware started to slow down, so a lot of operating systems do run on this computer, while a lot of old stuff like Windows XP and 2000 also run on this computer because it's also pretty old. So it's kind of from a weird in-between limbo where it's compatible with a lot of old stuff along with new stuff. Specifically, I used this computer to run Linux for a little while, since why not? And I also used this thing to run some old Windows beta builds, which were much better than trying to actually run it in a virtual machine, specifically because it's so old that it just has support for everything on a modern version of Windows. But I do keep an install of Windows in case I need it to do things, and I don't know, maybe I'll go ahead and redo that in a video soon. My recovery media videos always seem to do really well, and I do have the recovery media for this computer, so maybe another day. Oh, and apparently it can't even do the Windows Experience Index. Nice. Maybe I do need to reinstall this computer.